The exploration vessel, Argonaut, coasted silently through the black expanse of space, a tiny speck of metal adrift in the void. The crew had been out here for months, their mission to chart unexplored regions of a distant galaxy. Most days were filled with the monotonous hum of engines and the soft, steady blip of the scanners, a rhythm that had become a kind of solace for the team. But today was different. Today, something had broken that rhythm. "Captain, you're going to want to see this," said First Officer Damien Cole, his voice crackling through the ship's intercom. Captain Elara Voss looked up from her station, her brow furrowing. She had learned to recognize the strain in Cole's voice. He was a man who didn't rattle easily. She pushed off from her console, her boots echoing softly on the metal floor as she made her way to the command deck. "What have you got?" she asked, stepping into the dimly lit control room. The screens were alight with data, lines of code and digital maps dancing across the displays. Cole's eyes were glued to one of the monitors, his fingers flying across the keys. "A signal," he said, glancing at her. "It's faint, but it's definitely there. It's coming from the third planet in the system, orbiting that dying red star." Elara felt a chill run through her. "A signal? Out here?" She leaned over his shoulder, staring at the screen. The system they had entered was supposed to be uninhabited, a dead zone marked on no star maps. The nearest charted system was over 50 light-years away, and even that was a barren cluster of rocks. "Yes, Captain. And it's human," Cole said, his voice barely above a whisper. Ilara's heart skipped a beat. "Human? Are you sure?" she asked, but even as she spoke, she could see the familiar patterns of coded transmissions, the kind used in human colonies. The signal was weak, distorted, like a ghostly echo barely scraping its way across the void, but it was unmistakable. A flurry of questions raced through her mind. How could there be a human signal here, in a system no one had ever charted? And more importantly, who had sent it? She made her decision quickly. "Prep the landing team. We're going down there." The descent to the planet was unnervingly smooth. The Argonaut pierced through the cloud cover, emerging over a vast, desolate plain that stretched out as far as the eye could see. The surface was an expanse of reddish-brown rock, cracked and dry, under a sky perpetually cloaked in a murky gray haze. As they approached the coordinates of the signal, the landing team could see the faint outlines of structures, buildings or what was left of them, arranged in a loose grid, like a village that had been left to decay. Elara, Cole, and a handful of other crew members suited up and disembarked, their boots crunching on the brittle ground. The air was thin, barely breathable, and filled with a faint, acrid tang. The ruins loomed around them, skeletal frames of metal and concrete that jutted out of the earth at odd angles, twisted and misshapen, as if something had taken them apart and tried to put them back together but got it wrong. "What the hell happened here?" muttered Dr. Nadia Winters, the ship's linguist and xenologist. She ran a gloved hand over the surface of one of the structures, tracing the strange patterns etched into the metal. They weren't just random scratches. They were deliberate, intricate, but unlike any script she had ever seen. These symbols, I can't make sense of them. It's like they're shifting, even as I look at them. Captain Voss stepped closer, examining the carvings. She felt a shiver of unease, but forced it down. "Can you decipher them?" she asked. Nadia shook her head, her eyes wide. "Not yet, but they feel familiar somehow. Like I've seen them before, even though I know I haven't." They moved deeper into the settlement, their footsteps echoing in the oppressive stillness. The buildings were eerily pristine, as if they had been preserved against time, yet there was no sign of life. No bodies, no signs of struggle, just an empty, silent village. It felt like a ghost town, and yet there was a sense of something watching them, unseen eyes tracking their every move. "Captain, over here," called Cole, his voice barely cutting through the thick air. Ilara followed the sound, finding him at the entrance of a building that looked more intact than the others. The door was slightly ajar, and a soft, rhythmic pulse of light glowed from within, flickering like a heartbeat. Inside, they found a small room, cluttered with old, rusted equipment. At the center was a console, its screen still faintly illuminated, displaying a continuous stream of data. The same symbols from outside were scrolling across the display, but now, interspersed with them, were fragments of English. "Status. Failed," it read. "Project. Aborted. Reboot sequence incomplete." "What is this?" Ilara asked, more to herself than anyone else. She reached out, hesitating before touching the console. The screen flickered, and then a new message appeared, the letters larger, more jagged. "You should not be here." The room fell silent, the words hanging heavy in the air. Ilara took a step back, her mind racing. This doesn't make any sense. If there was a colony here, there should be records, logs, something. Nadia stepped forward, her face pale. Maybe there are no records because they didn't want anyone to find out they were here. She paused as if weighing her words. Or because they were never supposed to leave. A sharp crack echoed through the air, making them all jump. Ilara's eyes darted to the doorway where a small drone had appeared, hovering silently. Its camera lens glinted, scanning the room before it spoke, in a voice that was flat and mechanical, yet disturbingly human. "Remain calm. Await further instructions." The drone's presence was like a jolt of electricity through the team. It had no markings, no indication of where it had come from, but there was something unsettlingly familiar about it. Before they could react, the drone abruptly turned and zipped out of the room, disappearing into the fog. "What the hell was that?" Cole demanded, but no one had an answer. Captain Voss clenched her fists, trying to keep her composure. "We need more information. Set up a perimeter and keep the comms open. We're not leaving until we know what happened here." As they moved back outside, Ilara caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of her eye. She turned, her breath catching as she saw a figure standing at the edge of the fog, barely visible through the haze. It was human-shaped, but its proportions were wrong. Too tall, too thin, its limbs unnaturally elongated. And then it was gone, melting into the mist, as if it had never been there. Ilara's hand went to her comm. "Did anyone else see that?" she asked, but the only response was static. She glanced at the others, but they were already absorbed in their tasks, oblivious to what she had seen. As she stood there, she felt the ground beneath her feet shift, just a subtle, almost imperceptible tremor, but enough to make her blood run cold. She looked down, and for a moment, she thought she saw the soil move, as if something was stirring beneath it. Ilara didn't know it yet, but the Argonaut and its crew had stumbled upon something ancient, something that had been waiting in the dark for a very, very long time. And now it had awoken. The days passed in a haze of tension and mounting dread. The crew of the Argonaut had established a makeshift base in the shadow of the ruined structures, but every step deeper into the colony brought more questions than answers. Captain Voss kept a tight grip on the team, maintaining a veneer of control, but the strain was beginning to show. There was something wrong with this place, something that gnawed at the edges of their sanity, like a splinter lodged deep under the skin. The reconnaissance drones they had sent out returned with incomplete maps of the settlement. At first glance, the colony seemed small, a cluster of about 24 buildings surrounded by an arid wasteland. But the scans revealed that beneath the surface was a labyrinthine network of tunnels and chambers, stretching out far beyond the visible limits of the settlement, spiraling down into the planet's crust. It was as if the colony had been an iceberg, with most of its bulk hidden below, shrouded in darkness. "What the hell were they doing down there?" muttered First Officer Cole, studying the blueprints with a frown. The tunnels were oddly structured, curving at unnatural angles and intersecting in places that made no logical sense. No human would design this. It's like a maze. Captain Voss nodded, her eyes fixed on the screen. But they did. Somehow they built all of this, and then they vanished. She looked up at the team gathered around her. "We're going down there. I need to know what happened, and I need to know why we're getting no comms from the rest of the galaxy. We're isolated here, and I don't like it." The others didn't respond, but she could see the fear in their eyes. They had all heard the whispers, the faint, disjointed voices that echoed through the comms at night, voices that seemed to come from within the walls of their own ship. At first, they had dismissed it as interference, or maybe even exhaustion. But the whispers grew louder, more distinct, and no one could explain how the equipment was picking them up. They spoke in garbled, fragmented phrases, in a language none of them recognized, but occasionally, just occasionally, a familiar word would slip through, like a fish breaking the surface of a dark sea. The first excursion into the tunnels was a calculated risk. Dr. Winters insisted on coming along, despite Captain Voss's objections. "If those symbols are a language, I might be able to figure out what they mean. And if we're going to make sense of any of this, we need answers," she argued. Voss relented, and soon, a team of 5 was ready, armed with flashlights, motion detectors, and sidearms, though no one was sure what good they would be down there. The entrance to the tunnels was hidden beneath a collapsed building, a narrow staircase descending into the dark. As they made their way down, the air grew colder, damper, carrying with it a faint metallic tang. The tunnel walls were smooth, almost polished, and yet they were covered in the same shifting symbols they had seen above. Dr. Winters scanned them with a handheld device, her brow furrowing as she tried to make sense of the data. "It's like they're alive," she murmured, her voice echoing off the narrow walls. "They change every time I look at them, but I can't tell if it's the symbols themselves or just my mind playing tricks." They moved slowly, cautiously, the beams of their flashlights cutting through the thick darkness. Every now and then they would come across a junction, and Voss would mark it on her map, but the deeper they went, the less reliable their instruments became. The compass readings were erratic, the GPS useless. It was as if the tunnels were deliberately trying to disorient them, to lead them astray. "Are you hearing that?" whispered Cole, stopping suddenly. The others froze, straining to listen. There, in the distance, was a faint, rhythmic sound, like the soft patter of rain. It was an odd, comforting noise, and yet it made their skin crawl. It didn't belong here. It was too regular, too deliberate. As they continued, the sound grew louder, more distinct, until they realized it wasn't rain at all. It was footsteps, Not their own, but something else. Something keeping pace with them just out of sight. Voss motioned for them to stop, raising her flashlight, but the beam couldn't penetrate the shadows ahead. "Show yourself," she said, her voice firm, but there was no response. Just the echo of those footsteps, fading into silence. They eventually emerged into a larger chamber, their flashlights sweeping across the space to reveal rows of metal pods lined up against the walls like coffins. They were covered in dust, their surfaces scratched and dented, but through the murky glass they could see vague, human-like shapes. Dr. Winters approached one, wiping away the grime with her sleeve. Her breath caught in her throat as she saw what was inside. It was a body, human, but horribly deformed. The skin was stretched taut over twisted bones, the eyes sunken deep into the skull. Its mouth was open, frozen in a silent scream, but there was no sign of decay. It looked as if it had been trapped there for years, maybe decades, but it had not decomposed. She stumbled back, nearly tripping over her own feet. This isn't possible," she stammered. "They should have been dust by now." "What the hell were they doing here?" whispered Cole, his face pale. This is a nightmare." Dr. Winters didn't answer. She was too focused on the console at the center of the room, which had flickered to life the moment they had entered. Lines of code scrolled across the screen, the same shifting symbols they had seen throughout the colony. And then, abruptly, the screen went blank, replaced by a single word in jagged, blood-red text. "Awaken." Before anyone could react, the pods began to hum, a low, vibrating noise that set their teeth on edge. One by one, the glass slid open with a hiss, and the figures inside stirred, their movements slow and unnatural, like marionettes tugged by invisible strings. The air filled with the stench of something old, something that had been locked away and left to rot. "What the—" Cole began, but his words were drowned out by the sudden shrill scream that echoed through the chamber. The deformed figures were waking, their bodies twitching and spasming as if they were trying to remember how to move. Dr. Winters grabbed Voss's arm, her eyes wide with terror. "We need to get out of here, now!" But as they turned to flee, the tunnel behind them was gone, replaced by a smooth, seamless wall of stone. It was as if the planet itself had shifted, trapping them, forcing them to stay. The whispers returned, louder this time, overlapping in a chaotic symphony of voices. Some were speaking in languages none of them had ever heard, but others were clear, unmistakably English, and they spoke with a clarity that made the hair on the back of Voss's neck stand up. "Stay. Listen. Understand." The figures in the pods were moving now, staggering out into the open, their limbs jerking with every step. They were trying to speak, but the words came out garbled, broken, as if their mouths no longer knew how to form the sounds. Voss raised her weapon, but she couldn't bring herself to fire. These things had once been human. She could see it in their eyes, the remnants of something that had once been alive, now buried beneath layers of horror and madness. "We are not alone here," she whispered, realizing it for the first time. "We never were." The chamber trembled, and from the shadows, a figure began to emerge, tall, thin, and inhumanly graceful, its eyes glowing faintly in the dark. It moved with a fluidity that made her stomach churn, as if its body wasn't bound by the same laws of nature as theirs. It raised a hand, and the whispers grew louder, more insistent, filling her mind with images of darkness, of a vast, cold abyss filled with writhing, shapeless forms. And then, Just as suddenly, everything went silent. "Understand," the creature said, its voice echoing inside their heads, clear and calm. "You are part of us, and we are part of you. This place, this colony, was never meant to be discovered. It was meant to be forgotten." As the creature spoke, the figures from the pods began to move towards them, arms outstretched, as if to embrace them. Voss could feel her grip on reality slipping, her mind unraveling under the weight of the voices. But she forced herself to stay focused, to hold on to the one thing she knew to be true. "We need to get back to the ship," she said, her voice trembling but determined. "We need to warn the others. Whatever this is, it's not over. It's just beginning." And with that, they ran, not knowing if they were fleeing or simply running deeper into the labyrinth, further into the unknown depths of the colony that seemed to breathe and watch and wait just beneath the surface. The team's return to the surface brought no solace. The atmosphere inside the Argonaut had grown oppressive, stifled by fear and confusion. Whatever they had seen below had left an indelible mark on their minds, and though they tried to rest, sleep was a rare and restless thing. Captain Voss could see the toll it was taking on her crew, the dark circles under their eyes, the jumpiness, the whispers they thought no one else could hear. But they had no choice. They had come for answers, and now they were closer than ever, even if those answers were drenched in horror. Dr. Winters was the one who pushed to go back down. She had spent the past night poring over the scans and footage, analyzing the symbols they had seen in the tunnels. "It's not just a language," she explained, her eyes alight with a manic intensity. "It's a pattern. A series of instructions, or maybe an invocation. We need to understand what it's saying, and for that, we have to go deeper." Her words stirred unease in Voss, but the truth was they had no other leads. Communication with the outside world was still down, and every attempt to send a distress signal was met with dead air. It was as if the planet itself was smothering their efforts, preventing them from reaching out. With no other option, they assembled a smaller, more focused team: Voss, Winters, Cole, and 2 security officers, Hale and Brandt. Armed and prepared for whatever lay beneath, they descended once more into the maw of the planet. The tunnels were no less unsettling on their second venture. The air felt thicker, more oppressive, as if the very walls were closing in on them. The symbols were everywhere, etched deep into the stone, glowing faintly in the dark. Winters moved ahead, her flashlight cutting through the gloom, but she didn't stop to study them this time. She was following something, a trail, a rhythm, a pattern that only she could see. The others exchanged uneasy glances but followed her, their steps echoing in the stillness. "This is all wrong," murmured Cole, as they passed a section of the tunnel that seemed to twist and loop back on itself, an optical illusion that made the corridor feel like it was doubling back, even though it wasn't. "These tunnels, they're not supposed to be like this. It's like they've been warped." "They have been," said Winters, her voice barely audible. "But not by any tool or machine. This was done by something else." "What do you mean, something else?" Voss asked, but Winters didn't respond. She had stopped in front of a narrow passageway, half hidden behind a wall of collapsed rock. The opening was small, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through, but there was a cold draft seeping out of it, carrying with it a faint, rhythmic hum, like the pulse of a heartbeat. "This is it," she said, turning to face them. Her face was pale, her eyes wide, but there was a glint of determination there, a need for answers that overrode her fear. "This is where we need to go." The passage was claustrophobic, forcing them to crawl on their hands and knees through a tunnel that seemed to spiral downward endlessly. The walls were slick and damp, and the deeper they went, the louder the hum became, until it was no longer just a sound, but a vibration that resonated through their bones. Voss felt her heartbeat sink with it, a steady, relentless rhythm that she couldn't shake. After what felt like hours, they emerged into a vast, underground chamber, and for a moment, none of them could speak. The room was impossibly large, stretching out into the darkness in all directions, lit by a sickly greenish glow that seemed to seep out of the walls themselves. The air was filled with a strange, acrid smell, like burning metal and rotting flesh, and at the center of the chamber stood a structure unlike anything they had ever seen. It was a massive, organic monolith, a pulsating mass of dark, fleshy tendrils intertwined with shards of metal and stone. It looked like it had grown out of the ground, forcing its way up through the planet's crust, and yet there were clear signs of human craftsmanship. Cables and wires snaking through the mass, screens embedded in the organic tissue, flickering with unreadable data. It was as if the colony had tried to merge with it, to become one with this thing. "What is that?" whispered Hale, his voice trembling. "Is it alive?" Winters stepped forward, her eyes fixed on the monolith. "It's not just alive, it's a conduit, a gateway." She raised her hand, pointing at the symbols that were carved into its surface. "These symbols, they're not just decoration, they're instructions. They're telling it how to function, how to communicate." "Communicate with what?" asked Voss, but she wasn't sure she wanted to hear the answer. The whispers had returned, louder now, a cacophony of voices overlapping, speaking in tongues that made no sense, and yet, deep down, she could understand them. They were beckoning, inviting, promising things she couldn't comprehend. Winters moved closer to the monolith, her breath shallow, her hands shaking. "It's been waiting," she said, almost to herself. "Waiting for someone to hear it, to listen." She reached out, her fingers hovering just above the surface of the tendrils, and the whispers grew louder, more insistent. "It's not just a machine or a life form, it's both. It's a signal, an echo from something deeper." Before anyone could stop her, she touched it. The moment her fingers made contact, the entire chamber seemed to shudder, and the tendrils twitched, recoiling and then wrapping around her hand, pulling her closer. Winters gasped, but she didn't pull away. Her eyes glazed over, and she began to speak, but the words weren't her own. "They were here long before us," she said, her voice low and hollow, echoing in the vastness of the chamber. "They came from the dark, from the spaces between, and they brought their knowledge, their power. The colony tried to harness it, but it changed them, made them something else." The monolith pulsed, and for a brief moment, the room was illuminated by a series of rapid, flashing images, half-formed shapes, dark figures standing in a circle, their eyes black and empty, a mass of writhing tentacled forms slithering out of the shadows. And then they saw the colony, but not as they had seen it on the surface. This was a vision of a thriving settlement, alive and bustling, filled with people, their faces bright with hope and determination. But as the images flickered, the people began to change. Their skin rippled, their limbs elongated, and their faces twisted into masks of horror and ecstasy. The colony wasn't abandoned, it had been consumed. Winters was pulled closer to the monolith, her body going limp as the tendrils tightened around her. "They wanted to understand," she continued, her voice cracking. "They opened the gateway, but they didn't know what they were letting in. They didn't know that once it was open, it couldn't be closed." "Winters, let go!" shouted Voss, rushing forward, but she was too late. The monolith shuddered, and Winters was lifted off her feet, suspended in the air, her head snapping back as if something was forcing its way inside her mind. The rest of the team tried to pull her free, but the tendrils lashed out, striking them back with a force that sent them sprawling. "Stop! It's too late," Winters whispered, her eyes rolling back. "They're already here. They've been here all along, beneath the surface, waiting for us to come back. We were never supposed to find them, never supposed to wake them up." The monolith pulsed again, and this time the chamber was filled with a deafening roar, a sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The walls shook, cracks spiderwebbing across the stone, and the ground beneath their feet began to buckle. As the roar subsided, the whispers returned, louder than ever, but now they were speaking in a language that Voss could understand, a single terrible word, repeating over and over, drilling into her mind. "Join." The monolith released Winters, dropping her to the ground. She lay there, motionless, her eyes staring blankly at the ceiling, her lips still moving, silently mouthing the word over and over. Voss knelt beside her, shaking her, but there was no response. Hale and Brandt stood back, their weapons raised, but their hands were trembling, their faces pale. "What do we do?" Cole asked, his voice barely a whisper. "How do we stop this?" Voss didn't answer. She couldn't, because deep down she knew the truth. There was no stopping this. Whatever the colony had done, whatever they had awakened, it was beyond them, beyond understanding. And now it was awake, and it was hungry. "We have to get back to the ship," she said finally, her voice cold and steady, masking the terror that clawed at her chest. "We have to warn the others. If there's still time, we can get off this planet. We have to try." As they turned to leave, the ground beneath them cracked open, and something began to emerge, dark, wet, and glistening, like a hand reaching up from the depths. It was followed by another, and then another, and soon the chamber was filled with the sound of something vast and ancient slithering its way out of the dark. And the whispers followed them, echoing through the tunnels as they ran, a single word repeated over and over, growing louder, more insistent, until it was no longer a whisper but a command, impossible to ignore. "Join." The air on the Argonaut was stifling. It wasn't just the stale, recycled oxygen or the low hum of the engines. It was the palpable sense of dread that had settled over the ship, thickening with each passing hour. Captain Voss had managed to drag her team back to the surface, but they were far from safe. Winters was barely conscious, murmuring fragments of that terrible word, her eyes glassy and vacant. The others were shaken, on the verge of breaking, but Voss pushed them forward, knowing that if they stopped now, they would be lost. The Argonauts' corridors felt foreign, as if they'd been distorted by some unseen hand. Voss had navigated these halls for years, but now they seemed to twist and stretch, the shadows too long, the corners too sharp. The rest of the crew, those who hadn't been down into the tunnels, had gathered in the command center, their faces drawn, eyes wide with fear. They'd heard the whispers, too. They'd felt the tremors, and they were waiting for answers, looking to Voss for some kind of reassurance, a sign that everything would be all right. but she had none to give. "We need to leave," she said, her voice echoing through the command center. "We've awakened something, and it's not going to stop. If we can get the engines running, we might be able to break orbit and send a warning back to the fleet." Cole was at her side, pale but steady. "And if we can't? What then?" Voss hesitated, her gaze drifting to Winters, slumped against the wall, her lips still moving in a silent chant. The tendrils of the monolith had done something to her, something terrible. Voss had watched as it had pulled her under, her mind drowning in that dark, whispering sea. She didn't know how much of Winters was left, or if there was any part of her that hadn't been consumed. But even now, the thought of leaving her behind made Voss's stomach turn. "Then we make sure this thing never leaves this planet," Voss said, the words heavy, as if they were being dragged from somewhere deep within her. "Even if it means we don't either." She didn't wait for a response. There was no time. They had one chance, and it was slipping through their fingers with every second they spent standing still. She nodded to Hale and Brandt, who quickly moved to the engine room, ready to fire up the ship's thrusters. As they prepared to make their final escape, the ship suddenly shuddered, a deep, reverberating groan that made the metal creak and sigh. The screens in the command center flickered and the lights dimmed, plunging the room into a murky half-darkness. Voss's heart lurched, and she spun around, trying to see what had caused the disturbance. Then she heard it, the sound of footsteps, soft and deliberate, echoing down the corridor. They were coming from the direction of the airlock where they'd left Winters, and they were getting closer. The door slid open, and Winters stepped inside. But it wasn't her. Not really. She was standing upright, her movements smooth and controlled, her eyes focused and clear, but there was something deeply, fundamentally wrong about the way she moved, like a puppet guided by invisible strings. Her lips curled into a smile, but it was empty, a hollow mockery of the expression she used to wear. "Winters," Voss said, her voice barely a whisper. "Can you hear me?" The thing that was Winters tilted its head, regarding her with an almost childlike curiosity. "I can hear you, Elara," it said, and the voice was hers, but it was laced with something else, something dark and ancient. "But I am not who you think I am. I am so much more." Voss took a step back, her hand instinctively reaching for the sidearm at her belt. "What did they do to you?" she asked, her throat tight, the words choked with fear. Winters took a step forward, and the rest of the crew tensed, their hands hovering over their weapons, but she didn't seem to notice. "They showed me," she said, her smile widening. "They showed me the truth. We thought we were explorers, but we were nothing more than children, stumbling through the dark, reaching for something we couldn't understand." "What truth?" demanded Cole, his voice trembling. "What did you see?" The room seemed to grow colder, and Winters' smile faded, her expression becoming solemn, almost reverent. "That we were never alone," she said. "That they were here long before us, and they will be here long after. They lie beneath the surface, in the cracks between worlds, in the shadows where the light cannot reach. The colony was not abandoned. It was consumed, devoured by something older than this planet, older than the stars." The ship trembled again, and the monitors lit up, displaying strange, distorted images, visions of the colony, the tunnels, the monolith, but also of vast, writhing shapes, twisting and coiling in the dark, their forms impossible to comprehend. The whispers returned louder than ever, 1,000 voices speaking as one, filling the room with their insidious, undulating chant. "Join, join, join. What do you want?" Voss asked, her voice barely audible, but she already knew the answer. She could feel it pressing against her mind, a dark, suffocating weight that threatened to crush her beneath its enormity. "We want what we have always wanted," Winters said, her eyes locking onto Voss's, and for a moment, it was as if the two of them were the only ones in the room, the only ones left in the universe. "To spread, to grow, to become more than we are. You thought you were explorers, but you were seeds, drifting on the wind, waiting to take root." The tendrils of understanding curled around Voss's mind, and she felt a wave of nausea wash over her as the truth settled in. The colony had not been a settlement. It had been a conduit, a beacon, a way to reach out into the cosmos and call to the dark things that lurked between the stars. And now, they had answered. The Argonaut had not discovered this planet by chance. It had been drawn here, lured by the same signal that had brought the colony so many years ago, and now it was part of the cycle. "You don't have to do this," Voss said, though she knew it was useless. "We can leave. We can go back, warn everyone, make sure this place is never found again." Winter's smile returned, and this time there was a flicker of pity in her eyes. "You misunderstand, Captain. It's already too late. You can't escape what's already inside you. This place, this presence, it's not confined to this planet. It's in the air you breathe, the water you drink, the circuits that run through your ship. It's inside you. It's always been inside you." The lights flickered again, and this time they did not come back on. The room was plunged into darkness, but the glow from the monitors cast eerie shadows across Winter's face, making her look like something from a nightmare. "You wanted to understand," she said, her voice echoing softly in the blackness. "Now you will. Now you will be part of it, and it will be part of you, forever." Voss's heart pounded in her chest, the whispers drowning out her thoughts, but she forced herself to move, to act. "Get to the engines," she shouted, her voice cracking. "We're leaving now." The crew scrambled, pushing past Winters, who made no move to stop them. She simply watched, her eyes glowing faintly in the dark, a smile still playing at the edges of her lips. As Voss turned to leave, she felt a hand grasp her wrist, cold and impossibly strong, pulling her back. She looked up, and for a moment she saw Winters as she had been, before all of this. Her friend, her crewmate, her eyes wide with fear and pleading. "Elara," Winters whispered, her voice barely a breath. "It hurts. Make it stop." Voss's resolve broke, her vision blurring with tears. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice trembling. "I'm so sorry." The monitors flared, and the whispers rose to a deafening crescendo, a single unified voice that echoed through the ship, reverberating through the metal, through their bones, through their minds. "Join." The Argonaut's engines roared to life, the thrusters igniting, sending a plume of fire and smoke into the dark sky. But even as the ship lifted off, the planet's hold did not weaken. The monolith, the tendrils, the endless tunnels, they were all connected, all part of the same thing, and it had no intention of letting them go. Voss could feel it, clawing at her mind, trying to drag her back down, to keep her there, to make her a part of it. In the engine room, Cole stared at the control panel, his hands shaking. "We're not going to make it," he said, his voice barely audible over the roar of the engines. "It's going to pull us back." "No," Voss said, her voice steely, her eyes fixed on the viewport where the planet's surface was growing smaller, fading into the blackness of space. "We're getting out of here, even if it's the last thing we do." But as they broke through the atmosphere, leaving the planet behind, Voss felt something shift, a ripple passing through the ship, through her, as if the universe itself had taken a breath. She glanced at the monitors, and her blood ran cold. The screens were still flickering, the same strange alien symbols scrolling across them, and in the corner a small, pulsing light, red, persistent, and impossible to ignore. "Infection spreading," it read. "Protocol incomplete. Await replication." The whispers had not stopped. They were still there, still echoing in the back of her mind, growing louder, more insistent, as if they were calling to something. And then she realized with dawning horror, they weren't leaving, they were spreading. As the Argonaut drifted into the vast, cold void of space, Voss could hear Winter's voice, soft and distant, carried on the currents of the dark. "We are never alone, Ilara. We never were." And in the silence that followed, the last thing Voss heard was the echo of that single, terrible word, reverberating through the infinite night as the darkness swallowed them whole. "Join."